Ethan Carter's footsteps echoed against the marble floors of the courthouse, a victorious smile pulling at the corner of his lips. Another win. Another high-profile case closed. He adjusted his silk tie, relishing the stares of admiration and envy from his colleagues as he exited the building. But beneath the surface of his polished exterior, something stirred, a feeling he had buried long ago. It was dusk in New York City, the skyline a blend of gold and purple hues, casting long shadows on the bustling streets. Ethan walked briskly down the avenue, his mind already drifting to his next case, but something caught his eye. Sitting alone on a bench outside a dimly lit cafe was a woman. Her clothes were tattered, her hair matted, and her eyes, though vacant, held a story that seemed to call out to him. Ethan slowed his pace, his eyes locking onto the woman's hands. She was clutching a small, worn photograph. Curiosity gnawed at him. It would be so easy to keep walking, to let her be another invisible part of the city's fabric. But something pulled him toward her. Without thinking, he approached. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice almost mechanical, as if he were offering a legal service instead of simple human kindness. The woman looked up slowly, her eyes searching his. "Help?" she repeated, as though the word had long since lost meaning for her. She extended the photograph toward him, a picture of a little girl, smiling, with bright eyes full of life. "She's missing," the woman whispered, her voice cracking. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't the conversation he expected. He glanced around, suddenly feeling exposed, as if standing too close to her might unravel the perfect life he had meticulously built. But something deeper inside him stirred. There was something about this woman, about the desperation in her voice, that Ethan couldn't shake off. And for the first time in years, Ethan Carter, the man who had built a career on logic, precision, and winning at all costs, felt an emotion he hadn't felt in a long time. Compassion. Ethan stood frozen, the sound of the city around him fading into a dull hum. The woman's eyes, hollow and desperate, were locked onto his, as though she was searching for something, anything, that resembled hope. The photograph in her hand trembled slightly, the edges frayed and discolored from years of handling. I'm sorry," Ethan finally muttered, feeling a wave of discomfort. "What do you mean she's missing? Is this your daughter?" The woman nodded, her hands clutching the picture as if it were her lifeline. "She disappeared. Years ago. They said she ran away. But I know she didn't. I know she didn't." Her voice was barely a whisper now, trembling with emotion. Ethan's rational mind kicked into gear. People go missing every day, and while tragic, it was not something that he, a corporate lawyer specializing in mergers and acquisitions, had any business getting involved with. He should walk away. This wasn't his problem, yet his feet remained rooted to the spot. "What happened to her?" he asked before he could stop himself. The woman, Grace, as she introduced herself, looked up with tears threatening to spill over. She hesitated, as if weighing whether she could trust him, then sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I was a lawyer once, like you," she said softly, and Ethan's eyebrows shot up in surprise. She didn't look like a lawyer. She looked defeated, broken. "I was good at it too," she continued, her voice steadier now. "I had everything, a great career, a home, my daughter, Emma. But all of that changed when I took on the wrong case." Ethan's interest was piqued. A lawyer. There was more to this woman than met the eye. "What case?" he asked, though he could sense her reluctance. Grace shook her head. "It's complicated. I can't talk about it. Not yet." The lawyer and Ethan wanted to press her for more details, to dig into the specifics, but the human in him, buried deep under years of hardened professionalism, knew that pushing would only drive her away. Instead, he found himself doing something uncharacteristic. "Come with me," he said, gesturing to a nearby diner. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was warm and offered some semblance of privacy. He didn't know why he was doing this. He had nothing to gain from getting involved with this woman's tragedy. Yet here he was, opening the door to a conversation that could unravel everything. Grace hesitated but eventually nodded, following him inside. As they sat down at a booth, the waitress brought them coffee without asking. Ethan noticed how Grace held the mug with both hands, as if drawing comfort from its warmth. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," Grace began after a few moments of silence. "But I don't have anyone else left. They ruined me, took everything, my job, my home, my daughter." "Who's they?" Ethan asked, frowning. His instinct told him there was something much bigger at play here. He had seen powerful people manipulate the system before, but this felt different, more personal. Grace stared at him for a long time before she spoke again. "You won't believe me," she whispered. "No one ever does." "Try me," Ethan said, leaning in slightly. He was a lawyer. He had heard countless lies and excuses in his career, but there was something in Grace's voice that told him she wasn't lying. "I was working on a case, one that involved some very powerful people. It was supposed to be a routine corporate lawsuit, but then I stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to see. Evidence of fraud, corruption, and murder." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "Murder?" Grace nodded. "They threatened me, said if I didn't drop the case they would destroy me. I didn't believe them, until one day Emma disappeared, and everything fell apart after that." Her words hung heavy in the air. Ethan didn't know what to say. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented story Grace had told him. "Did you go to the police?" he asked finally. "They think I'm crazy," Grace said bitterly. "No one would listen to me. They said there was no evidence, that Emma had probably run away, but I know she didn't. I know they took her." Ethan was silent for a moment, processing everything. It was a lot to take in. He had spent his career in boardrooms and courtrooms where the stakes were high but rarely personal. This was different. This was a mother who had lost everything, and the system had failed her. "Why now?" Ethan asked. "Why are you telling me this?" Grace looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Because you're my last chance. You're the only one who stopped, the only one who listened." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle on his shoulders. He didn't want to be involved in this. He had his own life, his own career to think about. But he also couldn't ignore the feeling in his gut telling him that Grace was telling the truth. "I'll see what I can find out," he said, surprising himself. "But I can't promise anything." Grace's face softened, and for the first time, Ethan saw a glimmer of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. As Ethan left the diner that night, his mind was buzzing with questions. Who were the people Grace was talking about? What had she discovered that was so dangerous? And most importantly, what had happened to her daughter? He didn't know where this path would lead him, but one thing was clear: he was already in too deep. The next morning, Ethan arrived at his office earlier than usual. His desk was cluttered with files for ongoing cases, but his mind kept wandering back to Grace's story. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her situation than she had let on. Curiosity got the better of him, and he found himself searching through old legal records, trying to dig up any information he could find about Grace's career and the case she had mentioned. It wasn't easy. Grace had been a prominent lawyer years ago, but there was little trace of her now. Finally, after hours of searching, he stumbled upon a name that caught his attention: Grace Whitman. She had once been a top attorney at a prestigious firm, handling high-profile cases involving corporate fraud. But 10 years ago, her career had abruptly ended when she was disbarred for alleged misconduct. Ethan frowned. Misconduct? The Grace he had met didn't seem like the type to engage in unethical behavior. He continued reading, and as he dug deeper, he found something that made his heart race. Grace's final case had involved a major corporation, one that Ethan was very familiar with. It was the same company his current firm represented. Ethan's stomach tightened as he stared at the name of the corporation on his screen: Sterling Industries. He'd represented them in several mergers and acquisitions, believing them to be a routine, albeit powerful, client. But now, they were linked to Grace Whitman's fall from grace, and, potentially, the disappearance of her daughter. His mind buzzed with questions. What did Grace uncover in that case? Why had Sterling Industries gone to such lengths to silence her? Was there any connection between her disbarment, her daughter's disappearance, and the company's operations? Ethan leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of his newfound knowledge. He knew that poking around in this case could bring serious consequences, not just for Grace, but for himself. Sterling Industries had deep pockets and influence. If they had orchestrated Grace's destruction, they wouldn't hesitate to do the same to him. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. He needed answers. Grabbing his coat, Ethan left his office, heading straight to the courthouse archives. If there were records about the case Grace worked on, they'd be there. He had to see them with his own eyes. Hours later, Ethan was hunched over dusty case files in the courthouse's dimly lit basement. He'd finally found Grace's last case, one that had nearly slipped under the radar. The trial records were murky, filled with vague references to financial discrepancies and corporate misconduct. But buried deep within the documents, Ethan found what he was looking for: evidence that Grace had uncovered a massive fraud scheme involving Sterling Industries, a scheme worth millions. It wasn't just fraud. The more Ethan read, the more he realized this wasn't just about money. There were indications that Sterling Industries was involved in illegal arms trading, using their legitimate business dealings as a front. And worse, there were whispers, unconfirmed but disturbing, about people who had gone missing or mysteriously died after getting too close to the truth. This was bigger than he had imagined. Grace had been right all along. She hadn't just been disbarred for some minor infraction. She had been systematically taken down by a powerful entity determined to cover their tracks. And her daughter, Emma. Ethan couldn't even begin to fathom what had happened to her. He was still poring over the documents when his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. His gut twisted as he answered. "You need to stop digging, Mr. Carter," a cold voice said. There was no introduction, no explanation, just a warning. "Walk away, or you'll lose everything." The line went dead. Ethan stared at the phone in disbelief. His heart pounded in his chest. He had just been threatened. They were watching him. They knew he was getting too close. For a moment, panic surged through him. He could lose his career, his reputation, everything he had worked so hard for. But then, he thought about Grace, about her broken spirit and the years she had spent searching for her daughter. She had already lost everything, and no one had fought for her. How could he walk away now? The next morning, Ethan stood in front of the towering glass facade of Sterling Industries, his jaw set in determination. He had made his decision. He was going to dig deeper, no matter the cost. Inside, the building was as sleek and polished as he remembered, but now it felt sinister. Ethan's stomach churned as he approached the front desk, asking to speak to one of the company's legal representatives. He had a plan, though it was risky. He needed to make it look like a routine meeting, nothing more than a quick check-in with a longtime client. A few minutes later, he found himself in a conference room with Rachel Pierce, Sterling Industries' head of legal affairs. She was sharp, professional, and not someone to be taken lightly. "Ethan," she greeted him with a tight smile, "to what do we owe the pleasure? I wasn't expecting to see you today." Ethan returned her smile, keeping his tone light. "Just thought I'd drop by and check in. I've been reviewing some old case files, and there was one from years ago involving a lawyer named Grace Whitman. She was working on a case with Sterling at the time." Rachel's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something Ethan didn't like. "Grace Whitman? That's a name I haven't heard in a long time," she said smoothly. "Her career didn't end well, as I'm sure you know." Ethan nodded, keeping his tone casual. "I've heard the rumors, but I'm curious about the case she was working on. It seemed to involve some discrepancies with Sterling's financial records." Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept her voice even. "That case was handled internally years ago. I'm not sure why you'd be looking into it now." Ethan could feel the tension in the room growing. He had to be careful. "Just tying up some loose ends," he said with a shrug. "You know how it is. We like to keep our records straight." Rachel leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. "I'm sure you're aware that Sterling takes its confidentiality very seriously, Ethan. That case is long closed, and it's best if it stays that way. Digging into the past won't do anyone any good." There it was, a veiled threat, hidden beneath layers of corporate politeness. Ethan forced a smile. "Of course, just doing my due diligence." As he left the building, his heart pounded in his chest. Rachel had given him nothing, but her reaction confirmed his worst fears. Sterling Industries had something to hide, something big, and they were willing to do whatever it took to keep it buried. That night, Ethan sat in his apartment, staring at the city lights outside his window. He couldn't ignore the threat he'd received. Sterling Industries was watching him, and if they could destroy Grace's life, they could easily do the same to his. But he also couldn't ignore what he'd found. Grace wasn't crazy. She had been onto something far bigger than she'd realized, and they had silenced her in the most brutal way possible. Ethan knew what he had to do. He picked up his phone and called Grace. "I'm in," he said when she answered. "I'm going to help you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Ethan thought Grace might have changed her mind. But then, she spoke, her voice filled with both hope and fear. "Thank you," she whispered. "But you need to be careful. They'll come after you too." "I know," Ethan said, his resolve hardening. "But we're going to take them down." The next few weeks were a blur of covert meetings, late-night investigations, and mounting pressure. Ethan dug deeper into Sterling Industries' operations, uncovering a trail of corruption that went far beyond anything he could have imagined. Grace's case had merely scratched the surface. There were bribes, illegal arms deals, and evidence that implicated high-ranking officials in both the corporate and political worlds. Ethan knew he was in dangerous territory, but there was no turning back now. He had collected enough evidence to bring the case to court, but doing so would mean going up against some of the most powerful people in the city. One evening, as Ethan was preparing to file the lawsuit, he received another call. This time, the voice on the other end was colder, more threatening. "You think you're a hero, Carter?" the voice sneered. "You're not. You're just another pawn. Drop the case or you'll lose everything." Ethan's hands trembled as he hung up. He was scared, but he couldn't back down. Not now. Ethan's heart pounded as he sat in his office, staring at the phone that had delivered the latest threat. His mind raced with the implications of what he was about to do. If he moved forward with the lawsuit, he would be going head-to-head with powerful individuals, people who had the means to ruin him. But turning back now meant abandoning Grace and letting Sterling Industries get away with unimaginable crimes. He had to push forward. There was no other choice. The next day, Ethan filed the lawsuit. He wasn't just targeting Sterling Industries anymore. The evidence he'd uncovered implicated several high-ranking officials in the city, including some of the most powerful names in the legal and political world. It was a bold move, one that immediately attracted media attention. Within hours, the story was breaking across all major news outlets. Corporate giant Sterling Industries sued in massive fraud and corruption case. Ethan's name was everywhere, and so was Grace's. But Ethan knew this was only the beginning. He had made his move, and now the retaliation would come swiftly. The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, Ethan's phone was ringing non-stop. Reporters, former colleagues, and even old friends all wanted answers. But it wasn't just the media that was coming after him. His law firm, which had stood by him through years of success, suddenly turned cold. The partners called an emergency meeting. When Ethan walked into the conference room, the air was thick with tension. His managing partner, a man Ethan had respected for years, didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Ethan, what the hell are you thinking?" the partner barked. "Sterling Industries is one of our biggest clients. This lawsuit is career suicide." Ethan held his ground. "I found evidence, undeniable evidence of fraud, corruption, and worse. I couldn't just ignore it." "You should have," the partner snapped. "Now you've dragged us into a mess we can't afford. We're severing all ties with you, effective immediately." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His career, his reputation, everything he had built over the years was crumbling before his eyes. As he walked out of the firm, his mind spun. He had expected backlash, but the speed at which his life was unraveling was dizzying. Still, deep down, he knew this was the price he had to pay for doing the right thing. Later that night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, staring blankly at the skyline. The silence was suffocating. He had been a man of power, control, and logic for so long. Now, it felt like all of that had slipped through his fingers. His phone buzzed, breaking the quiet. It was Grace. "I heard what happened," she said softly. Her voice was thick with guilt. "You're losing everything because of me." Ethan shook his head, though she couldn't see him. "I'm not losing everything because of you. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. You didn't deserve what happened to you, Grace, and if we can expose Sterling, we might be able to find out what really happened to your daughter." Grace's voice trembled. "But what if they come after you next? These people, they don't stop. They won't stop until they've destroyed you." Ethan's chest tightened. He knew she was right. The threats he had received weren't empty. Sterling Industries had the resources to ruin his life, or worse. But if he backed down now, Grace would never get justice, and the truth about her daughter might stay buried forever. "I'm not backing down," Ethan said firmly, "no matter what." As the days passed, the lawsuit against Sterling Industries gained momentum. More witnesses came forward, emboldened by Ethan's stand, and the evidence piled up. The case was now a public spectacle, with everyone waiting to see how it would unfold. And then, in the middle of the chaos, Ethan received a call from a private investigator he had hired weeks ago to look into Grace's daughter, Emma. "You're not going to believe this," the investigator said, his voice crackling with excitement. "I think I found her." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Where?" "She's alive," the investigator confirmed. "I tracked down some old adoption records and connected the dots. Emma was taken from Grace, but she wasn't killed. She was given to a foster family, likely as part of some under-the-table deal to keep her hidden." Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the breakthrough they needed. "Where is she now?" he asked. "There's more," the investigator continued, his voice darkening. "Emma was adopted by a family connected to one of the very officials implicated in your lawsuit. They used their power to erase any trace of her real identity." Ethan's mind raced. This was bigger than he had imagined. Emma hadn't just disappeared. She had been strategically hidden to cover up Sterling Industries' crimes. And now, they had the proof. A week later, Ethan stood in court, presenting the case. The room was packed with reporters, lawyers, and spectators, all eager to see the outcome of the trial that had gripped the city. As he laid out the evidence, the fraud, the corruption, the illegal adoption of Grace's daughter, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about Grace anymore. It was about exposing a system that had preyed on the vulnerable for years. When Ethan introduced the proof of Emma's adoption and her connection to the officials involved, a gasp rippled through the courtroom. Grace, sitting in the back, covered her mouth with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. Her daughter was alive. After all these years, she was finally within reach. The defense tried to fight back, but the evidence was overwhelming. Sterling Industries and the corrupt officials behind the conspiracy were caught. They had no choice but to settle, and the public outcry grew louder with each passing hour. Grace was waiting outside the courthouse when Ethan stepped out. Her eyes were filled with a mix of disbelief and hope. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's over. And we found her, Grace. We found Emma." Grace broke down in tears, collapsing into Ethan's arms. It was a moment of overwhelming relief, a release of all the years of pain and suffering she had endured. "I don't know how to thank you," she sobbed. "You saved my life. You saved her." Ethan held her tightly, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. This was why he had become a lawyer, not for the money, not for the prestige, but to help people like Grace. Several weeks later, Ethan stood in the park, watching from a distance as Grace reunited with her daughter. It had taken time for Emma to process the truth, time for them to rebuild their connection, but the moment had finally come. As Grace and Emma hugged, tears streaming down both their faces, Ethan felt a profound sense of peace. He had risked everything to help Grace, and it had all been worth it. But his journey wasn't over. Sterling Industries had been exposed, but Ethan knew there were more battles to fight. The corruption that had destroyed Grace's life was still out there, lurking in the shadows. And as Ethan walked away from the park that day, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life. He had lost his career, his reputation, but in doing so, he had found something far more valuable: his purpose. Just as he was about to leave, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a threat. It was a call from a stranger. Another person, lost in the system, in need of help. Ethan answered the call. "I'm listening," he said. With Sterling Industries brought to its knees, the saga that began with a chance encounter between Ethan Carter and Grace Whitman finally reaches its conclusion. The trial not only exposes the corporate greed and corruption that tore Grace's life apart, but also restores her dignity and brings her the justice she has sought for years. Ethan, once a celebrated corporate lawyer known for his cold efficiency, emerges as a different man. His decision to risk everything for Grace, a homeless woman he barely knew, changes the course of his life. He has gone from a man who only cared about winning cases and maintaining his reputation to someone who fights for justice, no matter the cost. Grace Whitman, after years of living in obscurity and despair, finally receives the closure she has longed for. The court clears her name, and the media frenzy surrounding Sterling's collapse reveals the truth about the conspiracy that destroyed her career. For the first time in years, Grace is seen not as a disgraced lawyer, but as a courageous woman who stood against a corrupt system. The most important victory for Grace, however, is being reunited with her daughter, Emma. After years of pain, separation, and unanswered questions, Grace finally holds her daughter in her arms again. The moment is bittersweet. Emma, now a young woman, has lived a life without knowing the truth of her past. But as they begin to rebuild their relationship, there is hope for healing and the possibility of a new beginning. For Ethan, the lawsuit against Sterling Industries is more than just a legal battle. It is a turning point in his life. He loses his prestigious career and faces the scorn of his former colleagues, but he gains something far more valuable: a sense of purpose. The sacrifices he made for Grace and Emma remind him of why he became a lawyer in the first place. He rediscovers the part of himself that was lost in the pursuit of wealth and status. Ethan no longer works for the powerful corporations that he once represented. Instead, he becomes an advocate for the underdog, taking on cases that involve fighting injustice and standing up for those who have no voice. His transformation from a corporate shark to a defender of the vulnerable gives him a new sense of fulfillment. He realizes that true success is not measured by money or power, but by the lives he can help change for the better. The fall of Sterling Industries sends shockwaves through the corporate world. The company's once lofty reputation is shattered, and its executives are held accountable for their crimes. The case serves as a reminder that no one is above the law, not even the most powerful corporations. As Sterling's leadership faces criminal charges and the company files for bankruptcy, the story of its collapse becomes a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power and greed. The media frenzy surrounding the case eventually dies down, but the lessons it teaches resonate for years to come. Sterling Industries' downfall serves as a warning to other companies that corruption, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually be exposed. As the dust settles, Ethan and Grace both look toward the future with a renewed sense of hope. Grace, with her daughter by her side, begins the slow process of rebuilding her life. Though her career as a lawyer was stolen from her, she finds a new calling, working with organizations that help other victims of corporate and legal abuse. Her experience gives her a unique perspective and a powerful voice in the fight for justice. For Ethan, the case with Sterling marks the beginning of a new chapter. His decision to walk away from corporate law and embrace his role as a champion for the marginalized leads him down a path of personal fulfillment. He starts his own small legal practice, one focused on helping people like Grace, those who have been wronged by powerful forces and need someone to fight for them. The once stoic, untouchable lawyer has found his humanity again, and in doing so, he has discovered that true success is about more than just winning cases. It's about making a difference in the world. The story of Ethan Carter and Grace Whitman is one of redemption, justice, and the enduring power of human connection. What began as a chance meeting between two very different people spiraled into a battle against corruption that changed their lives forever. Ethan's transformation from a man driven by ambition to one guided by compassion reflects the profound impact that one decision, one act of kindness, can have. Grace's long journey to reclaim her life and her eventual reunion with her daughter shows the resilience of the human spirit. No matter how much she lost, she never stopped fighting for the truth, and in the end, she was vindicated. Ultimately, this story is a reminder that standing up for what's right, even in the face of overwhelming odds, is always worth the risk. Truth and justice, no matter how long they are delayed, will prevail in the end. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to stay connected with more powerful stories of justice, transformation, and the resilience of the human spirit. Let's keep the conversation going. Share this video with friends who need a reminder that the truth always finds a way, and leave a comment.